Okay,
Are we on?
you're on.
I'd like to call the meeting to order. Welcome to tonight's session of the Oxford, Ohio Board of Zoning Appeals. If anybody has any devices that could interrupt the meeting, I'd ask that you either turn those off or mute them at this point. We had a work session on May 13th, and during that session, we swore in all of the board members and officers were elected. Sam, you're going to be hosting tonight's session, is that right? Okay. As we get items on the screen, documents on the screen, as was pointed out in the work session, at the top of it, because it's a PDF, at the top toolbar, there is a two-part number. We have, I believe, 62 pages in this packet. So slightly left of center on the top toolbar as he displays documents, there'll be a number that'll say something like 38/62. And that's the packet page that will be on. So if somebody needs to review something, if you could tell Sam, go back to page 38, that'd be a big help for him. And what just dinged?
Me.
Roger, behave yourself. Okay, Sam, can we confirm that everybody's got audio? Sam, does everybody have audio?
Sam's muted.
Goddard does.
Yes, I've checked everybody's audio and every except for I haven't checked Chief Deathridge.
Okay. I don't see him online.
Can we
I'm here.
there he is. Okay, we'll mute him
Okay.
back.
Okay, helps if you go full screen. Okay, one thing that we have to do that's left over from our last regular session meeting of December 18th, 2019 is we need to approve the minutes. Looking at the minutes, board members, are there any additions, deletions, or corrections?
None that I saw.
Okay. Is there a motion to approve the minutes?
So moved.
Thank you,
Second.
Roger. I'm sorry, who seconded?
I did, Dan.
Thank you, Dan. Without objection, can we approve the minutes?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you. No objections. Okay, we've got 3 cases to hear tonight, and let's get into the first one. Is there a motion to enter into adjudication on BZA case 2020-01?
So moved.
Thank you, Roger. Is there a second?
Second.
Thank you. Any objection to entering into adjudication?
No.
Without objection, we are now in adjudication. Who's going to present for the city?
I will, Mr.
Thank you,
Chairman.
Zach. Thank you, Zach. Would you please state your name and your job title for the record?
Yes, Zachary Moore, planner for the city of Oxford.
Thank you. And would you please raise your right hand? Do you solemnly swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth in matters before this board?
I do.
Thank you. Please proceed with your testimony.
All right. Thank you very much. Sam is actually going to be broadcasting the slides, and then I'll just be directing him on when to transition to the next slide. So Sam, if you would pull up my presentation and I'll begin. Okay, great. So our first case of the night is a variance on lot coverage, and this is at 5111 Morning Sun Road. Next slide. The applicant is Scott Webb Architect, who is on the Zoom meeting, of course, with us. The property owner is H&M Properties. And the current use of the site, it's vacant, but there's an intended conversion to a mixed-use project. The current zoning for the site is NB Neighborhood Business District. The proposal, the variance that has been submitted for consideration, is an increase in the maximum lot coverage, which is normally 50% for this district, and that is found in section 1143.16 C4 of the Oxford Zoning Code. Next slide. Here is an aerial location map. I apologize. These maps are usually provided as part of the packet. Unfortunately, it didn't make it in this time, but luckily you do get to see it now as part of the presentation. So you can see the site location, the four corners there. This is the intersection of Sycamore Street and Morning Sun Road. So this is the northwest corner of that intersection. The lot itself, considering the legal size of it, it totals a little over 50,000 square feet, which is a little over 1 acre in size. But in consideration for zoning standards, we would take the lot area minus the right-of-way. And so the size, if you take out the right-of-way, it drops down to a little over 40,000 square feet, which is just a little bit under an acre. Next slide. And here is the same map, but showing the zoning classifications. This is currently the only property in town that we have zoned neighborhood business NB. It is surrounded by office industrial zone to the north and to the east, and R1MS to the south, and R2MS to the west. Next slide. So that section of the zoning code, again, it provides the following, that the maximum lot coverage in the NB district is 50%. Next slide. So this is the relevant provision that we're talking about. There's also a fairly lengthy purpose statement for the NB district. And since this is the first potential site in town to be developed under these neighborhood business district standards, I felt it was important to touch upon the purpose statement. So I'm actually going to read this verbatim. This district is intended to provide small scale retail and services on sites in or near residential areas, which it is, in fact, while having little impact on them. Uses are limited in scope to promote local orientation. Development is intended to be compatible with the scale of surrounding residential areas development through pedestrian orientation or limited auto orientation when the site is adjacent to collector streets. Next slide. So here's just kind of pointing out some of the key terms. So small in scale, emphasis on retail, in or near residential, limited in scope, compatible, and a focus on pedestrian orientation. And when you have auto orientation, the focus on that is much more limited. Next slide. Looking at the property in a different way, this is actually an aerial view, so a bird's eye view looking to the north. So you can see roughly half of the site right now is wooded and the other half is cleared. And you can see some of the surrounding uses. You see the Best Western Sycamore Inn there to the east and the veterinary hospital to the north. Next slide. And then this is switching looking west. So just a different view of the property just to get you acquainted. Next slide. Okay, so this is the site plan that Scott Webb has submitted to us, showing the proposed development. Eventually, this development would come in as a building permit review, and their intention is to comply with the zoning standards. So this would be more or less an administrative review that would be done by staff. It would not necessarily need a discretionary review. It would not go through a conditional use process. So that's been indicated that that's the intention for this project. They're proposing 2 buildings, each totaling 2,500 square feet of footprint area. These are mixed use buildings, so they would have both commercial and residential contained within them. There was a recent lot split of this property. You'll notice right down the center there, it looks like the lot has been divided into 2 triangles. I don't know, Sam, if you can use your cursor to kind of point out where I'm talking. Yes, exactly. So that line right there, that was a recent lot split that was approved administratively earlier this year. That was reported at the March 10th Planning Commission meeting. Basically, they submitted that. They followed all of the code requirements and staff approved that. So I think it's at this point, we're still waiting on that to be officially recorded or to at least receive proof of the recording, which they have 6 months to do that. But essentially, once these lots are divided, this is the development proposal that they have in mind. So this is designed with the NB neighborhood business district standards in mind. And drawing up the design of the project, it was realized that they were going to need a slight increase in the lot coverage in order to actually make it happen. Thus, this is sort of a variance request that they are submitting ahead of time before actually applying for that building permit. So looking at the two lots, so I'm going to address these as the northeast lot and the southwest lot, just like is labeled there. So the southwest lot, that totals 19,837 square feet. And the proposed lot coverage for that lot is just above 50%. It's actually 50.53% is what they're proposing. And the northeast lot, which is a little bit bigger, 20,608 square feet in total. The lot coverage there is the greatest at 56.51%. So those are the lot coverages that they are proposing. And I think if you combine everything together, like if you consider this all one site, the overall coverage percentage would be around 53%. The exact number is cited in the staff report if you need me to refer to that. Slide.
Is that all you have, Zach?
No, I've got one more slide. A couple more slides, actually. So this is actually a better slide for what I was previously talking about. So you can see the coverage areas highlighted in blue and in orange, highlighting those percentages. And then if you consider both lots together, it's coverage of 53.58% overall. And next slide. And then these are some of the renderings that Scott Webb has submitted to our office, demonstrating the intended look of the project once built. So there's actually a shared plaza between the buildings, kind of a patio seating area that's shown. They are set back quite a bit from the street, and focusing back on that purpose statement and kind of the orientation of the parking. The intention is to keep the parking out of the front yard, situating it to the back. So less emphasis on the parking, more emphasis on the facades of the buildings in the street frontage and the street presence of these two buildings. Next slide. Okay, so the last slide is the decision criteria. So I'll go through each of those one by one. So for criterion A, it's whether the property in question will yield reasonable return or whether there can be any beneficial use of the property without the variance. The property is currently vacant and has been for some time. So staff believes there can in fact be beneficial use of the property that would yield reasonable return without the variance. The property as currently exists is developable by right under the standards of the NB district, which allows for a number of permitted uses and also a host of conditional uses. Criterion B, whether the variance is substantial. So the applicant is asking for a 6.51% increase to the maximum lot coverage from 50% to 56.51%, which is the highest percentage for that northeastern lot. That is a 13.02% difference in value. And based on those figures, staff does not believe that the variance request is substantial. Regarding criterion C, the next one, whether the essential character of the neighborhood would be substantially altered or whether adjoining properties would suffer a substantial detriment as a result of the variance. Staff does not believe the essential character of the neighborhood will be negatively affected, but rather will be complemented in a way that does embrace the vision of the NB district expressed by the code. And the shared plaza space between the two buildings, we feel is a welcome addition, and this would further contribute to the overall pedestrian orientation of the development, which is what is strived for under the NB district purpose statement. Criterion D, whether the variance would adversely affect the delivery of governmental services such as water, sewer, and garbage. The fire chief has provided some comments. You may have seen those in the report concerning the accessibility and orientation of proposed off-street parking area for emergency vehicles. And while these comments are certainly pertinent to the overall design and development of the site, our community development staff, we don't believe an increase in the allowable lot coverage would have a more adverse impact on this particular issue than the normal coverage limit of 50% would. And we did share those comments directly with Scott, with the applicant, so he would be aware of those. And that could be something that would be addressed at the time of the building permit review when it actually comes forward again. Criterion E, whether the property owner purchased the property with knowledge of the zoning restriction. And as Mr. Webb's letter states, the property owner was previously aware of the lot coverage restriction that was associated with the NB district. When it was actually rezoned back in October of 2018. And the initial NB provisions, those were adopted by council in August of 2016. Criterion F, where we're getting through them one by one here. Whether the property owner's predicament feasibly can be obviated through some method other than a variance. So the owner's predicament could possibly be obviated by just redesigning the site in a way that does strictly adhere to 50% coverage maximum. It's not too much of an increase from that 50% up to 56%. However, a number of accessibility features that are proposed, including the pedestrian spaces, the connections, the pavement widths, those would probably have to be reduced as a result of that. The building sizes could also be reduced, but this would diminish the overall allowance by the code, which does allow for up to 2,500 square feet to be established on any given lot in the NB district. And the last one to touch on is criterion G, whether the spirit and intent behind the zoning requirement would be observed and substantial justice done by granting the variance. So one of the key standards of the NB is to have all that parking located to the side or to the rear of the building. And that's in keeping with the qualities of a walkable urban neighborhood. No more than 50% of the frontage upon a street is allowed to be used for parking drives or spaces. So in this scenario, the parking related standards are competing in a sense with the maximum lot coverage allowance because side and rear parking require more surface area in order to connect to somewhere where there is vehicular travel. In this case, it's the public street there on Morning Sun Road and on Sycamore. In addition, the shared patio and plaza is proposed as an amenity feature that would connect the buildings together, which also happens to contribute to the bottom line coverage percentage. So for these reasons, we believe the applicant has made a good faith attempt at adhering to the most important standards of the underlying district while only slightly compromising the resulting lot coverage. Therefore, we believe that granting this variance would uphold the spirit and intent of the zoning code, and we recommend approval of the variance. And that concludes my report. I'm happy to take any questions from the board.
Any board member have any questions? Roger.
Yeah, Zach, I've got a question. Slide back to slide 12. On the lot split, and I'm not sure this is relative, but looking at the lot split on that slide, it appears as though the parking lot of the northeast lot is actually overlapping the southwest lot. I guess my question is, why split the lot that makes the percentage of the northwest lot higher and the encroachment is a question to me.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question. So the reason that the lot was split was to have two buildings on the site, each total 2,500 square feet. The maximum per lot in this district is 2,500 square feet. So if you have just one lot, if the split wasn't done, then you'd only be allowed one of those buildings. So they're trying to design it in a way that gets them the two buildings by splitting the lot down the middle.
Okay. So it's just literally a code reference.
The reason for the split is due to the code.
Okay.
Here to the code. Yes.
That answers me. Thank you very much.
Chris Allison.
Zach, I noticed there's parking on the north side of the building, of the northwest building. And I'm wondering, is that a requirement or is that something the applicant wishes?
The parking would be a requirement, and the number of spaces is dependent upon the uses of the building, which I don't believe are precisely determined at this time in terms of the commercial uses. And I think the applicant could really speak to this better than I could. But what Mr. Webb did share with me at one point was his calculations in terms of the numbers of spaces that could potentially be required depending on what uses were going into those buildings. And our code does have some minimum parking space requirements dependent upon use. So, and Mr. Webb can correct me if I'm wrong, but essentially what this design shows is sort of the maximum potential number of parking spaces that would be necessary in order to establish any of the potential uses, you know, whether it be retail or restaurant or office. Those parking standards all differ per our code. So that was kind of the intent behind this, was to sort of, you know, stretch it out enough to where it could meet any potential scenario that does develop.
I see. Given that the NB is designed for pedestrian more than auto, I was wondering if eliminating that, maybe you can answer this question, would dramatically reduce or make it much closer to the lot coverage that's necessary without a variance.
Well, and the thing is, it's kind of, the parking standards are sort of in competition in a way with the purpose of the NB, which is to have less emphasis on the parking. But in order to reduce the parking in a way that is less than what the code requires, that would require a variance in order to do that.
Understand. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Chris. Anybody else? Nobody else has any questions for Zach? Zach, thank you. And who's going to present? Scott, are you going to present for the appellant?
Yes, please.
Okay, state your name for the record, please.
Scott Webb.
And are you the agent for the appellant?
I am.
And would you raise your right hand, please? Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth in matters before this board?
I do.
Please proceed.
Okay, well, thank you, Mr. Chair and members of Board of Zoning Appeals. We're very excited about this project, and being the first project to go through as a neighborhood business development, I think we're, you know, kind of treading some new water here and trying to understand how this district will really work. You know, we had talked about other areas in town when we created this district. You know, this could be ideal for the mile square, and I think, you know, parking was never really addressed for this district. It doesn't have separate parking requirements than really any other district in the city. So to kind of answer Chris's question, you know, at this point, you know, the choice was, do we ask for a lot coverage variance or parking variance? In this particular situation, based on its location across from the Days Inn and, you know, with a fairly busy intersection there, not a lot of street parking, we felt it might be important for the success of these businesses to provide a little parking on site, since we had the land to do that. So that being said, kind of as an introduction, I guess I shared a couple slides with Sam. So if you don't mind, I'll start that.
Please do.
All right, so to start with, perhaps what's not so evident when you're looking at this in plan is the amount of grade that's going on this property. And it's a little bit represented here. The site is falling pretty dramatically down Morning Sun Road, and then also falls to that rear corner. The good news here is that that allowed us to create kind of some garages, sort of a walkout basement on the back side. But there's a significant grade difference between the two buildings, and there's a significant grade difference as we move around to the back for the parking. So some of the shape of the drives, the turning radiuses are based on allowable grades, safe grade passage, as well as maneuverability for fire and everyone else. But in doing that, you know, rather than have two isolated parcels here, this thing is really driven by the notion of them sort of acting together and sharing this plaza space. So we can go to the next slide, please. So these are the the slides that Zach has already shown you to some degree, the two site plans. Staff agreed that the less than 1% for the southeast lot was not really worth asking for a variance for, and they handled that administratively. So we're really only here talking about the northeast lot. As you can see, from the northernmost entrance, and let's make a point of the fact that we wanted to keep the entrances as far from the intersection as possible. So that's sort of located that intersection. And as Zach pointed out, in order to meet the code requirement, we want to provide some parking spaces. Those parking spaces need to be handicap accessible. So there was a grade issue there, and you can see the number of ramps that we're building along the side just to get up to grade even from that, and then get around to the back. But as they pointed out, whenever you're trying to put parking behind a building and you have to access it from a 2-lane drive, you're eating up a lot of lot coverage in just the road that it takes to service that. To go back to Roger's question, we monkeyed around with the math quite a bit in order to try to get these to balance identically with this plan and not have to ask for lot coverage variance in either case. As it turns out, we're just a hair over and decided to proceed. So the idea here is that the parking for the potential customers, including the handicap spaces, are provided up on the high side of each of the two lots, and then employee parking down in the back. You can see we're also having to set aside some land area for stormwater management, which is part of it also. And then in order that the residents on the upper levels don't compete for parking with either the employees or the customers, we've tucked them actually under the building in garages to meet the residential requirements. So all of those are sort of tucked back in there. And then we can go on to the next slide. So in order to kind of encourage this pedestrian friendly and to accommodate this grade, we created this plaza that sort of joins the two buildings. You can kind of see in the pink in the center of that rendering there, there's another significant ramp that gets you from the plaza up to the next building. The idea being that, we wouldn't want someone to, a person requiring accessibility wouldn't want to park to visit one of the businesses in one building and then literally have to drive around the corner and park in the handicap spot in the other building just to be able to visit these two businesses. So we felt this was a real opportunity to create something unique. But there is certainly more than 6% of our lot coverage is being spent in this plaza. So, the short answer as we get to the decision standards is, we could eliminate the plaza, we could shrink it, we could do something like that and probably get back under our lot coverage. But we felt it was worth asking for this small variance in order to achieve this look that we were going for here. So next slide, please. So again, this just kind of shows the kind of look of it and what the plaza will look like, and kind of I've done sort of a constructed sort of a topo there. Each one of those steps represents a foot, so you can kind of get an idea of how much grade is really going on in every direction as we get here. So, and then lastly, last slide is just the decision standards. In pretty much all cases, I agree with staff. I think that the plaza is necessary and desirable for the development of this area. We think it helps to meet the pedestrian-friendly requirements of this particular district. The variance, we agree, is not substantial, nor is the essential character going to be adversely affected. The delivery of governmental services, these site plans were prepared not by an architect, but actually by civil engineers. So turning radiuses and grades have been accounted for to reassure Chief Dethridge that we'll be able to get everybody around this building. As we said, we were aware of the property restriction, but just decided to kind of come on and make this presentation ahead of time. And then lastly, we do feel that the spirit and intent of the zoning code is met here, and hope that you will see that as well. One point I think that was missed is part of this, what's key to this development, both for fire access and for everyone's access, is there will be a shared access agreement between the two properties that allow that passage from one lot to the other. And to answer your question, Roger, about the little encroachments and things like that, that'll all be absorbed in the shared access easement for the shared parking for the rear of both buildings.
Is that all you got, Scott?
That's all I got. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Does anybody have any questions for Scott? No questions. Thank you, Scott. Wait a minute. Chris Allison.
Could you clarify the parking under the building? Is that completely like a basement so that the commercial area is full depth of the building? Is that correct?
No. So the way it works is the commercial area is the grade level, accessible level of the building where the plaza is. In both buildings have commercial on the ground floor. There's a story and a half of residential above that ground floor, but the parking for the residential is actually below the ground floor. So
below the residential.
Yes.
Or I mean below the commercial.
Yeah, that's specifically for the residents, so they don't have to compete, with customers or employees. They have their own dedicated parking spaces, and they're inside the building with garage doors, just like a typical garage.
And I assume a dedicated entrance.
Yes.
Okay, that's all. Thanks.
Thank you, Chris. Dan Hazeman.
Oh, you're muted, Dan.
Dan, you got to unmute. There you go.
Can you hear me?
We hear you.
How many units will you have for rental for residents? You have 8 parking places.
Yeah, there's 2 apartments in each lot.
Okay.
And each apartment is required to have 2 spaces, so that's why we have 4 spaces shown for each building.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Anybody else? All right, Scott, thanks for your presentation. I see we have John Dethridge on the panel tonight. John, could you unmute? I'd like to get some testimony from you, please.
Okay.
There he is. Please state your name.
John Dethridge.
And your job title with the city. Thank you, sir. Could you raise your right hand for me, please? Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, nothing but the truth matters before this board?
I do.
Thank you, sir. Do you have any prepared testimony that you'd like to offer in this, or could we just ask a couple of questions?
You can just ask questions.
Okay. The only clarification that I need out of this is that it's kind of unusual to get you to respond on one of the comment forms, and you expressed a question, perhaps not a concern, about accessibility of your equipment onto this property. In light of the testimony tonight, are you satisfied that either now or through plan review, those concerns will be addressed?
As long as Scott's committed to making sure we've got room to get the ladder truck through there and that parking's not going to be an issue. Some of the places in town specifically, the first ones that come to mind are like some of the fraternity houses that have limited parking. Students want to come in and park there and it blocks our access to the buildings. I just want to make sure something like that's not going to happen here, where it looks like there's a fairly small amount of parking for, the number of residents and a couple of businesses there that could have people parking where there's not parking spots.
Understood. So, okay, well, Scott, I think you've got his concerns on that. Anybody on the board have a question for the chief? Chris Allison?
Hi, could you tell me if you've looked at hydrants and so on, given the increased density of the fire in this load in this area?
I have not, but just off the top of my head, I'm going to tell you that there's at least one at that corner, and I believe there's one by the vet's office, and a couple more on Sycamore that we should have plenty of coverage there.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks, Chris. Anybody else have any questions? All right. Thank you, Chief. Appreciate it.
You're welcome.
Okay. Is there anybody else that wishes to testify in this case? Nothing. Okay. Chris Conard, question
Mr.
for you real quick.
Like Sam is raising his hand. He wants to say something.
I missed him. Was that, you say Dan?
Sam Perry.
Sam Perry, what do you have?
I just wanted to report that there were no attendees virtually wishing to speak at this time.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Chris Conard, are you online?
I am.
Question for you here, sir. We've gone through the decision standards. Would you prefer that those decision standards be incorporated into the motion, or would you prefer that I go through and kind of compare and contrast for the board?
I think we're okay if you want to put them in a motion based upon what I've heard.
Okay, thank you. In light of that is, go ahead.
Mike, before we go forward, I think you were going to make a disclosure, which I didn't hear.
Not on this,
Not
not on this
one?
case.
Okay. Okay. All right, good.
Okay. In light of that, is there a motion?
I'll make it.
Go ahead, Roger.
In relation to BZA 2020-01, in reference to an action request for a variance of section 1143-6 or .16, section C4, the 50% lot variance coverage, I move that we grant the variance based on criterion B. It's not a substantial. Criterion C, the neighborhood is not going to be substantially altered. I actually believe it's going to be improved. Criterion D, it is not going to affect government delivery. And criterion G, it is within the spirit and intent of the zoning.
Thank you, Roger. Is there a second?
I second.
Ms. Rubin here seconds. Roll call, please. Chris Kennard, are you going to handle the roll call tonight?
I was going to do that.
Okay.
Okay.
If that's okay. I'll start with Mr. Hazeman,
Yes.
and then I'll go to Mr. Ames,
Yes.
Mr. Allison,
Yes.
Ms. Ruminaire,
Yes.
Mr. Snipper.
Yes. Vote is 5-0. The variance is granted. Okay, let's go to our next case.
Can I ask a point of order in here or just clarification as the new kid? On those criterion, do we have to approve all of the criterion or at least one or some or?
The burden of proof is on the appellant. And I think that we've shown in this particular case that the overwhelming proof is that it warrants a variance. So I think that it's preponderance instead of each individual one. But we can go through them one by one, especially if we have a contentious case. Okay. Anybody else? Okay. Let's go to our next case, which is BZA case 2020-02. And before we begin this, I need to disclose that Tom Conrad is a customer of mine, a very minor customer, less than 1% of my gross for my business. There is no contract. There is no ongoing relationship in terms of the contract. It's on strictly a per need basis. And because it is so small, this will not affect my ability to reach an unbiased decision in this case. Everybody okay with that?
I am.
Yes.
Thank you. Okay, next case is 2020-02 at property address is 2220 East Withrow. And they're seeking two variances to parking space size under sections 1149.03C and parking space location under section 1149.04A. Is there a move to enter into adjudication?
I so move.
Dan
Second,
Hazeman, Dan Hazeman, so moved. Is there a second?
second, Chris.
Chris Allison seconds. Getting a little tricky on those mute buttons, isn't it? Is there any objection to entering into adjudication? Without an objection, we are in adjudication. Who's going to present for the city, please?
I will, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. For the record, please state your name and job title.
Zachary Moore, planner for the city of Oxford.
And would you please raise your right hand? Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth in matters before this board?
I do.
Please proceed.
Thank you very much. And same deal as last time, Sam is going to pull up my presentation.
Just a moment. I don't have it ready yet, so give me a second if you want to fill the void for 10 seconds.
I think we can wait on you, Sam. We'll give you the 10 seconds.
Okay, great. Thank you, Sam. So as Mr. Schnipper already said, this is a variance request, in essence broken out into two different subjects. It's parking space size and parking space location. And this is at 220 East Withrow Street. Next slide, please. The appellant is Scott Webb Architect. The property owner is Irish Red Hawk LLC. The current use on site is a single family dwelling. The current zoning classification is R2MS, single and two family mile square residential district. And the proposal is variances to sections 1149.03C and 1149.04A, parking space size and location. Next slide, please. Here is the location map showing an aerial and the property location. This is basically in the middle of the block on East Withrow Street. This is more or less in the northeastern quad of the mile square. You can see the McCulloch Hyde parking lot there on the far left-hand side, which is toward the west. So this is the block between North Campus Avenue and University Avenue on that north side. And it's abutting an alley, which goes across from East Vine Street to. Next slide, please. And here's that same map again, but showing the zoning classifications in the vicinity. As you can see, it's zone R2MS, which I've already said. And it is surrounded by properties that are zoned the same way as well. This is a residential area. Next slide. Okay, so here are some site photos, and I thought I would just give you kind of a brief background / history on this particular site before I get into the details on the case. These photos were taken April 29th, so this was a site visit. And what happened with this property, there was a stop work order that was issued March 26th when it was discovered that the attached garage, which you can see there on the right-hand side, that was being converted into living space without a permit. So that was the reason why the stop work order was issued. So a building permit was then submitted by Mr. Scott Webb on April 14th. So this is what I would call sort of an after the fact permit. It was a way to acknowledge the work that had already begun in light of the zoning code to adhere to all the relevant standards. And zoning, we denied that permit on April 16th. So that is what led to the variance request for this property. Next slide. So some relevant zoning provisions that I want to touch upon that are related to this case. So section 1149.02A, this is in our parking chapter of the zoning code, provides the following. It says that any new development, redevelopment, or change to a use or structure or site, whether conforming or non-conforming, shall meet the current parking and site access regulations for the entire use and structure and site. Next slide. So this is like sort of the key terminology from the section. So in staff's denial, we cited the term redevelopment. And essentially our argument is that by adding an additional bedroom, which is what they are doing with this garage, they're converting it to an additional bedroom for this house. That is in essence expanding the use. And the rule that we have operated under, that when you expand the use, it triggers this section, which requires adherence to the current parking and site access regulations. Next slide. So the standard that is then in turn triggered by this expansion of the use is for a single family dwelling, which is the principal use involved. It's an existing single family, that it has to have a minimum of 2 parking spaces. So essentially what we were checking for as part of the building permit review was that these 2 parking spaces would be provided in some way on the site. Next slide. So a section 1149.03C, this gets into the dimensional requirements in order to have a required parking space to actually satisfy the numerical requirement of a minimum of 2. So it says that all off-street parking spaces shall contain a minimum size rectangular area, and the standard size is 9 feet of width by 18 feet of length. Next slide. So those numbers 9 and 18, that essentially gets packaged together as the variance for the size of the parking spaces. So keep those numbers in mind. Next slide. Additionally, 1149.04A provides the following. It provides that parking spaces shall not be located within 3 feet of any lot line. And number 4 says unenclosed parking spaces, which is what the applicant was showing on an existing driveway. They are not enclosed by a garage. That's the difference. Unenclosed is out in the open. When you have an unenclosed parking space, that shall not be located within 3 feet of any principal structure. Next slide. So the numbers to keep in mind for, now we're talking about parking space location. So remember the 2 subjects, size and location. So the numbers here are the same, but talking about 2 different things. One is the setback from lot lines, which is the 3 feet, and the other is a setback from the structure, which is also 3 feet. And I will note it is, I believe it's stated in the staff report, we do not apply that 3-foot setback when there's right-of-way involved. So a lot of projects in town, a lot of our redevelopments that we see in the mile square where there are alleys present, our applicants and builders will basically build the parking right off the alley. So they'll put in the hard surface parking spaces directly off of it. So we do not apply that standard to the right-of-way wherever a property abuts right-of-way, but we would apply it where a property is abutting another property, which in this case would be that northern property boundary, which you'll see here in a second. Next slide. So here's a bird's eye view looking to the north. So you can see the property there highlighted in yellow and how it's right there bordering on a corner between the alley and East Withrow Street. Next slide. And then here's a view looking to the east. So this view, you can get a sense for where that existing attached garage is located. It's there on that left-hand side, and it is attached to the main structure through a mudroom. So you can see that there, that's kind of indented there in the middle between the main part of the house and the garage. And thank you, Sam, for pointing that out with your cursor there. Great. Thank you. Next slide. These were the elevations that were submitted along with the building permit. So this shows filling in that former garage door area and putting up new vinyl siding, and then also adding a window on that northern facade. And the window, I believe the photo showed that the window had already been installed on the structure. Next slide. And then this was the floor plan that was also submitted with the building permit. So this shows you a portion of the existing floor plan. So you can see in the middle there, there's the mudroom that connects the attached garage to the rest of the house. And you see they're noting there in the middle for that former garage space that is intended to be a new bedroom. Next slide. So this is essentially the site plan that kind of summarizes their proposal and how they are navigating through the code standards and what their intended variances are. If you go to the next slide, Sam, it should pop up with a graphic. There you go. So that is delineating the two required parking spaces. So remember, a minimum of 2 are required. So they're showing the 2. So they do satisfy that requirement. But if you go to the next slide, Sam, that'll provide an additional detail. Okay, so the blue line is the right-of-way line that's depicted. So you can see that there's a portion of the spaces that is overlapping with the right-of-way. And that is not allowed by our code. In order to have an off-street parking space actually be considered off-street, it has to fall on the private property itself. It cannot be, a portion of it cannot be in the right-of-way. Next slide. So then with my familiar colors, the orange and the blue. So the orange area is just delineating the portion that falls within the right-of-way, and then the blue portion is the portion that falls on the private lot itself, the actual property itself. So I will describe the blue portion dimensions for you, because this in essence describes the dimensions of the parking spaces. If the variances were granted, these are what those dimensions would be. So for the parking space length, it would be going down from 18 feet to 15.7 feet approximately. The parking space width, they are actually showing 8-foot widths as opposed to 9 feet. And that's true for the red lines that are shown there. And the reason that is, we may need to refer back to the slide later that shows the photos. You may have caught that there are 2 retaining walls on either side of the driveway. I think there might be a future slide about that, but that's essentially the reason for the reduced width is due to those existing retaining walls. The setback from lot lines, this was something that staff could not verify during the building permit process. Just there wasn't enough information provided for us to know that. But at this time, with the application for the variance, it does appear based on where the lot line is depicted there to the north that they will actually meet that requirement with a distance of 4.8 feet. So that would meet the 3-foot requirement. So that is actually not a concern based on their plan. However, the setback from a principal structure is still 3 feet. And as you can see, those blue areas are touching right up against the garage. So that is still a problem. So a lot of those numerical figures that you would see in my staff report on pages 1 and 2, it kind of straddles across. It's at the bottom of page 1, and then the table continues onto page 2 of the staff report for this case, kind of summarizes in a table, excuse me, those numerical standards. So a lot of those numbers, I had to basically pull those directly off of the site plan that was submitted, just do some measurements on my own, and that's how I was able to summarize everything. So just want to make sure that was clear. And actually, the next slide will show you some photos. So next slide, please, Sam. Okay. So that upper left-hand photo, so you can see where that garage door used to be. And you can see, you can really see the retaining wall that's there on the southern side, which would be on the right-hand side of the image, right there. There was one of those Wheeler totes out when I went out to visit there. There's the other retaining wall. You can see a little bit of it on that left-hand side. Perfect. Thanks for pointing that out. So you got a couple different shots of the alley that are provided. The top right image is looking toward the south, toward Withrow Street. So you got the garage there on the left-hand side. The bottom left image is looking to the north, so it's looking the opposite direction of the alley. And then that bottom right image is really interesting because this actually shows a relatively recent parking area that was installed off of an alley to meet the required parking for whatever project that may have been. And you can see how that comes directly off of the asphalt alley there. This would be to the north and then to the west of the site in question. Next slide. Okay, so we've arrived at the decision criteria. So I will go through those one by one, as I always do. So for criterion A, whether the property in question will yield reasonable return or whether there can be any beneficial use of the property without the variance. The property's previous and continued use as a single family dwelling is sufficient to demonstrate that there can be beneficial use of the property without the variance. Criterion B, whether the variance is substantial. So the applicant is asking for a 12.8% decrease in the parking space length, an 11.1% decrease in width going from 9 feet to 8 feet, a 100% decrease, so an elimination in a sense of the principal structure setback. And if you express it another way, so this is again kind of getting into sort of extracting those numerical standards directly off of the plan. So if you consider the principal structure setback to actually be met, which is the 3 feet, then basically it's coming at the opposite direction from what you would for the parking space length. So if you say that that requirement is met, then you would be asking for a reduced length of the parking space down to 12.7 feet. So that's just something to keep in mind with that. The applicant does allude to the code's alternative compact space standards, which are normally 8 feet by 16 feet. And these only apply to up to 25% of 40 or more parking spaces. So it's meant for a larger parking area. And thus this is not applicable to a single family residential situation. Staff believes the percentage reduction in parking space size deserves greater scrutiny than other dimensional standards would, such as those for building height or setbacks, since the allotted area is really intended to sufficiently accommodate the standard sizing of vehicles. And I just Googled it. The average width of a car is around 6 to 6.5 feet. The average length is about 17 feet long. So therefore, staff considers a request to reduce the actual stall dimensions down to 8 feet by 15.7 feet to be a substantial request. Regarding criterion C, whether the essential character of the neighborhood would be substantially altered or whether adjoining properties would suffer a substantial detriment as a result of the variance. So by granting these variances, this would invite the possibility of cars parking in a 90-degree manner with bumpers overhanging the alley, or only one car parking in a sideways fashion on the existing driveway, which would potentially have a negative impact on impeding access for other nearby residents utilizing the same alley. And though these types of situations may have already been occurring prior to the garage conversion project, staff must nevertheless consider the practical implications of designing 2 legal required parking spaces within the smaller confined area near the alley. Should also be noted that the alley width is only around 13 feet wide, with retaining walls on, there's not only retaining walls on the subject property, but there's also a wall on the neighboring property to the west, which is at 214 East Withrow. And this makes maneuverability into the driveway a challenge, especially when you're trying to accommodate 2 vehicles versus only 1. By contrast, for a brand new parking area with the 90-degree stalls, So say it was a larger parking area, you would have a required aisleway width. So in a way, the alley is kind of substituting for an aisle. For a 90-degree stall parking area with an aisle, we would require 24 feet to give you sufficient area to maneuver a vehicle in and out of a parking space, which is nearly double the existing width of the alley that is present. Regarding criterion D, whether the variance would adversely affect the delivery of governmental services, garbage pickup for this property actually does occur on the public street, not the alley. So it's unlikely that the garbage collection would be negatively impacted by granting the variance. This is something that I did check into with Rumpke. Staff does not believe any other governmental services will be negatively impacted in terms of water, sewer, and garbage. Criterion E, whether the property owner purchased the property with knowledge of the zoning restriction. So Mr. Webb's letter makes the argument that the property owner did not know the unused garage was considered a required parking space. The applicant's claim that the permit denial was based on eliminating an existing parking space, albeit one that may have been unused, is not an accurate assessment. The permit was in fact denied due to the expansion of the use and failure to provide adequate parking per the zoning code somewhere on the site. The previous condition of the site in terms of the number of required parking spaces that may or may not have existed was not relevant to our decision to deny the permit. The owner has, however, previously submitted a number of building permit applications to the city and should have been familiar with the required process before undergoing work at the property. Regarding criterion F, whether the property owner's predicament feasibly can be obviated through some method other than a variance. So we have an extra layer of complexity here that is added due to the work that has already been completed on the property without prior approval of the building permit. So denial of the variance could necessitate the applicant making more substantial structural changes on the site to accommodate parking in a way that would comply with the code. Or alternatively, and probably at much less financial cost, the garage would just have to be restored for use as parking with the additional living space eliminated. Regarding criterion G, whether the spirit and intent behind the zoning requirement would be observed and substantial justice done by granting the variance. So staff does not believe the requested variances uphold the spirit and intent of the zoning code. Had this request been actually brought forward prior to the commencement of work, the practical consequences of reducing those parking dimensions would have been the exact same logic behind it, and we would have led to the same conclusions on this case. And that concludes my report and my presentation. I'm happy to take any questions from the board.
Thank you, Zach. Are there any questions for him from the board?
I have a question.
Mr. Manier?
The garage was designated as a parking space?
No, it was not. What we do when there is a change to a site that expands the use, what that does is it triggers the parking requirements. So previously it would have been, we have no way of knowing truly whether there were, whether that was a required parking space, whether it would have met the requirements, you know, in terms of how many there may have been, you know, whether it was one or two, we just don't know. All we know is what is presented to us in the form of an application. And when you present something that it in turn expands the use of the property, then we're just looking for those two parking spaces to be satisfied in some way.
Okay,
So
I got it.
hope that answers your question in a way.
Thank you. Anybody else? Zach, I got a question for you. Prior to this, it appears that those two parking spots would have been used. How was that permitted? Was that a grandfathered situation?
I don't think I have the answer to that in terms of, I don't really know the history behind it or exactly when this property was developed. So I don't think I have a good answer to that, but What I can say, depending on like, if there were no parking spaces there that met the code, then it would be in essence a non-conforming situation. And that non-conformity has to be brought up to code when you do something in a way where it triggers the code requirement, which is what is happening here in this case.
I I understood the last portion of your answer. I was just looking to see how this was permitted in the past, and the only logical assumption to me would be grandfathered situation. So thanks for your answer.
Yeah,
Sam Perry.
Sam has some additional comments. Yep.
Sam, go ahead, please.
Do you need to swear me in or no?
Well, if you're going to testify, then I guess we better. Please state your name and job title for the record.
Sam Perry, City of Oxford Community Development Director.
And with your right hand already up, do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth and matters before this board?
Yes, I do.
Please proceed.
I do have a floor plan from the approved rental permit that I could share that shows that part of the building labeled as a garage. It doesn't have the dimensions, but I don't know if you want to see that, but I can put that on the screen.
If you think it would help, please go ahead.
So it's 3 pages. So there's the first floor. And there's a second floor with 2 bedrooms. And then this is an overview that shows, if you can see my cursor, there's a label here showing garage and the mudroom. So
Okay.
that's all I have to share.
Okay. Well, while you're there, anybody have a question for Sam? No questions. Thank you, Sam.
Mhm.
Wait a minute, Dan, I see you waving. Go ahead.
That plan showed from, it was 1993, I believe, is the date on that plan. So that's been that way for 30 years. Is that correct? So it probably would be grandfathered in, wouldn't you think?
Sam, I think he's directing that question to you, Sam.
Yeah, I can answer that to the best of my ability, which is that codes change over time. And so at the time that the rental permit was applied for and approved, we don't know what codes were in effect. So these floor plans are submitted not for parking, but for rental code safety compliance. And so every time there's a renewal of the application, there's a new floor plan has to be submitted. If there's no changes, then the owner resubmits the previous floor plan. So I think what your question is alluding to is that if it was the same owner over a long period of time, the floor plan didn't change. So I don't know if that helps. I can't guarantee that, the garage or the parking was grandfathered and met some previous requirement, but I can tell you the reason why the document would have been in the file, which was to show the spacing of the bedrooms and the egress points for safety. This was the primary purpose of it.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Thank you, Sam. Anybody else have something for Sam? Okay. Scott, are you?
Well, I want to clarify a point.
Go ahead, Chris.
So for purpose of the record, that the city became aware that there was construction going on without a permit, and that construction covered up an existing garage door. And that's kind of depicted in the photograph that we see.
Yes.
Yeah. So there is no evidence one way or another of whether or not, because there was a garage door, presumably the garage door worked, and it was not being used as living space because it was indeed a garage. Is that right?
Yes.
Is
Yes.
that correct? Yeah. I don't have anything else.
Okay. Chris Allison?
So it's my understanding that how it was used before doesn't matter. all we're interested in is how it's used after the change.
You're correct.
Okay.
Anybody else? Okay. Scott, are you going to present for the appellant?
I am
Okay. State your name for the record, please.
Scott Webb,
And are you-
architect, agent for the applicant.
That's what we need. Raise your right hand. Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth in matters before this board?
I do.
Please proceed.
All right, let's go ahead and just start the slide if you would, Sam. All right, well, thank you for hearing this case this evening. I think Zach did a nice job of sort of explaining how we got here. And to be clear, it was not my recommendation that he start working without a permit. I do a lot of work for this client and we get permits every time. This one, he kind of renegated it. So I'm joining this after the fact. That being said, I think one of the most important points here is staff has referred to this on a couple different occasions. And the reason that we're in front of the board tonight is they're calling this an expanding of the use. And yes, in fact, we are changing the way we're using part of what's inside the walls of this existing structure, but it's not an expansion of use in terms of there's no more people going to live there. There's no more cars going to be required, no more parking required. It doesn't affect in any way the use of the particular building when we talk about the expansion of the use. So yes, we are taking over an unused garage, but again, no, the use itself is not changing. There's no more than 4 occupants. It is simply a single family residence. So starting there, the point of this is, as I think Zach did a very good job presenting, is that there was never any legal parking spaces in this thing, save perhaps the garage. But I think it's pretty evident from anyone that's been by there or that has ever seen a student rental, it's pretty rare that anyone parks in these garages. And the garage was simply very small and not in very good shape. And rather than simply replace the garage door, my client decided he could go ahead and finish it since no one was using it anyway. So that's sort of why we are here this evening. That being said, the essence of the Board of Zoning Appeals is a practical difficulty. So to say that because we are, changing the use of something inside, now we have to provide up to the minute parking spaces. The practical difficulty here is there simply is not any room on this site to provide legal parking spaces. There never has been, except one, which doesn't meet the current requirement if we count the garage. And there's just simply no place to put them. You can't park in the front yard. There's not room down the side. So that's really why we're here today. So if we can go on to the next slide. So, this is kind of reiterating a little bit what Zach had pointed out. The parking spaces have been there since the building has existed. This was the driveway for the house, always has been. There's no expansion of the driveway. There are retaining walls, as Zach pointed out, on both sides of this driveway. There's an alley behind it and a garage door in front of it. So apparently the only legal parking space was perhaps the garage, which was simply not used. But the point I really want to make here is that, we've heard a lot of math going on here, a lot of percentages, a lot of overhanging into the alley and not far enough from the building, and looking for giant percentage reductions, and that's what makes it substantial. The issue at hand here is really not the parking, is my point from my application. This hasn't been parking for 30 years. It's not parking now. The garage itself. So these are the parking spaces that have existed since this building was constructed. And that's all we're asking, is that we can simply leave them. So, That's really the essence of the thing. So the staff report has kind of focused on the math of the existing driveway and using that to find that the variance is substantial. Our point is that this variance is not substantial because nothing is changing. Nothing is changing in the neighborhood. Nothing is changing in the driveway. Nothing is changing in where cars currently park in this neighborhood. The garage has never been used for parking. Certainly since my client owned the property, I sincerely doubt it's been used for parking in the last 30 years since it became a student rental. So the point is, it's not substantial because nothing is really changing at all in the neighborhood. So that being said, I'd like to go straight to the decision standards. On the last slide, please. So will the property yield a reasonable return? Sure. It was an existing single family house and would continue to be. This makes it a little more appealing. This is an area that Planning Commission and City Council determined over the last couple of years that they want students to live, this northeast quad of the Mile Square, to make these places more attractive for students to live there is a good thing and is in line with the goals of both planning and City Council for this part of the city. We believe that the variance is not substantial because it changes nothing with regard to the parking arrangement. The driveway is the driveway as it's always been. There's on-street parking as there's always been. The alley is what it's always been as well. To try to apply a backing standard, as Zach had mentioned, would mean that none of the alley parking, the picture that he happened to show of 209 North Poplar was a project we did last year for the same client. That parking was allowed to come straight off the alley. The alley's still only 16 feet. You've never really had 24 foot of backing anywhere in the city when you allow parking off the alley. So I think that point is kind of moot there. So again, we feel the variance is not substantial. We feel like the essential character would not be affected because there is no change in occupancy and there's no change to the realistic actual parking in this neighborhood. The delivery of governmental services doesn't change. If people are parking there now with their tail hanging out, perhaps they should be cited. But nothing that we're doing changes that in any way. Whether the property owner was aware, I would say he's certainly aware, as Zach pointed out, that he needed a building permit, and I have scolded him profusely on that matter. Nonetheless, even with the requirement for getting a building permit, he was not aware that he would be prevented from finishing this garage because of a parking requirement, because of the existing parking. So whether or not the property owner's predicament can feasibly be obviated through some other method, yes, and I think you've answered that. He could simply put the garage door back in its place. That being said, this is a single family home. He would not be prohibited from adding new windows to his existing garage. He would not be prohibited from drywalling his existing garage. He's not prohibited from heating his existing garage. All of those would simply be allowed. So what we're really talking about is whether or not you want him to put this garage door back or not, because it's not going to let people park inside. They're not going to, and it's not going to change the parking spaces on the outside. So the issue at hand is whether my client can finish this empty shell of an unused garage for some other purpose or not, and not really a mathematical percentage question with regard to whether it's substantial. So I'd be happy to answer your questions, and I appreciate your consideration.
Thank you, Scott. Are there any questions from the board members?
Yeah, Mike.
Roger?
Yeah, as Mr. Webb, you stated that in your testimony that Mr. Conrad has been your client in a number of different cases. I infer from that he is not an unsophisticated first-time real estate investor in the city of Oxford. He knew better than to build without asking for a permit, or should have known better. And did that involve applying for a permit and then finding out you have to get a variance? Yeah, probably. The variance would have ended up here one way or another. So to say it's not a subject of concern kind of bothers me. And the fact that we're taking a non-conforming property, making it even more non-conforming by trying to add two non-conforming parking spots.
Well, we're not adding any parking spaces. We're leaving what is existing.
Because when you change the building, you have to bring it up to code. You're asking us to allow two non-conforming.
Go ahead,
Yes,
Scott.
and the practical difficulty lies therein. The space that has always been the parking is simply not large enough. We can't move the building and we can't move the alley. This is the space that is available on this property to park. That is the practical difficulty. That is the reason for the variance. And to your point and the one that Zach made, whether my client renegated this thing or applied for the building permit, the issue would really be the same. And the practical difficulty would be the same.
So the practical difficulty is the same, but the issue is not the same. You're adding more living space, which means you have to bring it up to code.
Yep.
So
Yes, and the practical difficulty is that when we do that, we have to provide parking. Sorry.
I'm sorry. To me, that practicality is not the same. It could be left alone for another 30 years. Nobody would ever question it. But as soon as that building permit is required and the new living space is added, it adds the essence of the code as written that you have to bring it back up to the code or get a variance, one or the other.
Sure, and that's why we're here. And the practical difficulty is there's simply the existing parking does not meet the current code. We don't have a new place to put it. We're not asking to put in new parking spaces that don't meet the code. We're asking for the thing to remain in its current state. And that is the practical difficulty. We can't move the garage, we can't move the alley. But we have to provide parking. So we're providing it to the greatest extent physically possible on this site.
That answer your question, Roger?
To a degree. But my question is more a point than it is a question. It's both. But
So taken. We understand. Do you have anything more, Roger, that you'd like to add?
Not yet.
Okay, thank you. Chris Allison?
Yeah, this may be a question for Zach or Sam. I'm looking at 113704B, and it talks about improvements to a structure, which is definitely what this is, converting something from a garage to a living space. And under there, it says improvements to a structure containing a non-conforming use may be permitted subject to the following conditions. And in there, it says a renovation. For renovations, the following shall apply. Any structure may be maintained to its original footprint, no reductions in occupancy. So I'm not sure that a variance is really required here. He's not changing the non-conformance. He's not increasing the floor space. What he's doing is renovating part of the existing structure.
Scott, do you want to address that, or does somebody else want to address that?
Let staff.
Hmm?
I said we can let staff address that.
Okay, Zach, would you care to comment on that?
Yes, certainly. That's a great question. So yeah, thank you, Mr. Allison, for bringing up that standard. So the answer to your question is that those provisions apply to non-conforming land uses, and the subject at hand is not a non-conforming land use because it's single family.
Correct.
So those standards,
So I have
those
the wrong
provisions
section. Okay.
would not apply to this situation. A
Great,
great,
thank you.
very great question.
Agreed. Thank you. Scott Webb?
Zach, are you saying that if this were a non-conforming land use, we could expand into the garage based on that section and not need a variance, but because it's a conforming land use, we can't?
If this were a non-conforming land use, then the section that Mr. Allison cited would apply. So in
So a
dealing with,
variance would not be required for a non-conforming use?
I'm sorry,
A variance would not be required for a non-conforming use?
if this met the definition of a renovation, then the statement would apply that any structure could be maintained to its original footprint, no reduction in occupancy. So as long as the occupancy was not increased.
But again, we're talking about a land use, not a structural use, correct? In other words, the section that Mr. Allison cited is not applicable in this case. Is that correct, Zach?
Not applicable in this case. That's correct.
Thank you. Chris Allison, I see you're still unmuted. Do you have anything to add?
Yeah, no, not really. I have to think it through a little bit more.
Okay. Did that answer your question for you though?
Yes, I was looking at the wrong section.
Thanks. Appreciate it. Anybody else have anything? Okay, Dan Hazeman. There you go. Whoop, there you go.
What's the intended purpose of this new use? Is it going to be a rec room? Is it going to be a TV room? Is it going to be a bedroom? What's the intention of it?
Scott, you want to answer that?
Yeah, so the intention is just to be another room in the house. We called it a bedroom because we wanted to make sure that egress windows were installed, that if it were ever used as a bedroom. We really don't have codes that tell you how you can use the inside of your house, but just to make sure that all options were covered, we designed it so it would comply for a bedroom in case someone would ever decide to use that as the bedroom and use the old living room that's now a bedroom. Maybe they'll turn that back into a living room someday.
Are they going to increase the occupancy?
No, and we're not allowed to increase the occupancy, and we're not intending to.
Dan, did that answer your question?
Yes, it did. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Scott. Anybody else have anything they'd like to add?
Yeah, I do.
Ms. Ruminier?
It seems to me this whole question about the occupancy and the structure is irrelevant because the requested has to do with parking. So even though Scott said that this has to do with the change of use, the structure, and other issues, it's not about parking. The request, the action is about section 114903, which has to do with parking, and everything that staff has stated has to do with parking. So I guess I need clarification on that. Is this a variance request to change the parking requirement, or is it a variance request that I don't see to change the building?
No, it's strictly about parking.
Okay, so we really should only be talking about parking if we're talking about this variance.
Correct. Correct. Sam Perry, could you do something for me, please? Go back to Scott's presentation, go to page 2.
I have a couple questions for clarification when the time is right.
Okay. Let's give Sam just a minute to get that back on the screen for us. Go to page 2, please. There you go. Sam, if you can take your cursor, you've got the highlighted area there that's the lot. At the upper left-hand corner, there is something white that appears to be a vehicle, and it's parked at kind of an oblique angle into what would be 2 parking spots. To me, that's showing the impracticality of trying to put 2 spots in there, because we've got one that's already demonstrated he's not going to use it correctly. And if it was used correctly, meaning a 90-degree orientation to the alleyway, it would show to me that the tail of the car would already be projecting out into the alleyway, again, showing the impracticality of granting this variance. Sam, or excuse me, Scott, do you have any comment on that?
Sure. So the question at hand would be, whether we asked for simply the elimination of the parking requirement, which we could do, and all of the same points would be here. We don't have room for parking on this site. The site just simply isn't big enough. We opted instead to say we're providing the parking to the greatest extent possible, and maybe in that regard applied for the wrong variance. I mean, maybe we should simply have asked for the elimination of the parking requirement, with the practical difficulty being that there really is no place for code compliant parking anywhere on this site.
Okay, thank you. Anybody else have any comments on this slide while we've got it up? Okay, thank you, Sam. Chris Kennard, you were going to offer some input.
Yes, I want to clarify something. I went to the code and I did not see a definition within the Oxford Code of garage. So I went to my phone app, and the definition of a garage is a building or indoor area for parking or storing of motor vehicles. So, Mr. Webb, my question has to do with your review of the standards, specifically E, which says whether the property owner purchased the property with knowledge of the zoning restriction. And then the comment there is the property owner was not aware that the unused garage was a required parking space. Wouldn't the solution be to turn the garage into the parking space? That's what it was designed to do. So if there's renovation going on to the space, there's inadequate parking for the residents of the structure. Why not use the garage, which is what it was designed for?
Well, simply put, it is a very, very small single car garage. When my client purchased the property, as I said before, they typically don't allow student rentals to park inside little garages like that. It's been used for storage in the past, storage not for a vehicle. To answer your question, we could return it back to a garage. And as we said before, it could be a garage that was never in fact used. We're still not going to meet the requirement for 2 parking spaces. But yes, we could put the garage door back on it and call that a parking space and not be here.
Chris Kennard, do you have something else?
Well, I'm still in a new phase as the law director, so I don't profess to have an intimate understanding of the code, but there is a parking requirement for the zoning in this area, which is the R2MS. Is that right?
Yes.
And what is the parking requirement based upon the size of the structure? How many spots are needed? 2?
Yes.
All right. I don't have any other questions.
Thank you. Did I see somebody else with their hand up? Okay. Anybody have any questions for Scott? Anything else? Okay. Thank you. John Dethridge, are you still with us?
Yes, sir.
I'd like to get some input from you on this, please. For the record, state your name and job title, please.
John Dethridge, I'm the fire chief.
And would you raise your right hand? Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth in matters before this board?
I do.
Thank you, sir. Do you have anything that you'd like to add to this discussion?
Could you say that again? You broke up.
I'm sorry. Is there anything that you would like to add to this discussion?
Basically just what I had added on the review. Usually when something like this is done in town, especially if it's done without a permit, which is the way this is started, somebody's planning to put more people in those rooms. That was my concern with the whole thing when Sam alerted me that this was going on. Nobody knows what the true intent was, but that's where my issues fall. It's also my understanding that this property owner is one of the ones that doesn't participate in the, what do you call it, Sam? The in-person rental inspections or the inside rental inspections.
That's correct.
So if those would have been turned into bedrooms, nobody would have been aware of it.
Okay. I'm trying to put on my fire hat here, so to speak, with,
Hold on, Mike. Can I ask John a question?
sure, go ahead, Roger.
Sam, could you put that second slide of Scott's back up again? Because it refers to the question I want to ask John. Looking at the pink section in the left-hand picture where the proposed sites are covered, John,
Mhm.
with the car parked in front of the exit to the back of the house, does that propose a safety issue to you as fire chief and EMT and our principal safety person for the city?
Yeah, you pointed out a good thing right there. It would be we would have a tough time trying to get into the back of that structure through that mudroom door there if we were trying to attack a fire in that garage. It would be
And my
very,
second question leading on the same area is, with two vehicles in there, would you still have access for your ladder truck through the alley should that become necessary for this structure or any other structure off the alley?
well, I can tell you, our efforts, we're gonna do everything we can not to put the ladder truck in that alley. But I can tell you, we do have issues trying to get around in the alleys just in staff cars and ambulances. When these cars are hanging out into the alley, it makes it tough. There's a lot of places in town that have these garages that are too close to the alley, where cars hang out, and it is tough to navigate those alleys.
Thank you, sir.
Roger, great question. And Chief, thanks for your response. Leaving that same screen on there, does anybody else have a question pertinent to the screen? Okay. Chief, I've got a couple of questions there because obviously OFD gets some calls for vehicle fires. Would I be correct in assuming that the reason for the 3-foot separation in an unenclosed parking area would be to separate a car should it have a vehicle fire from the principal structure? Is that a safe assumption?
I would say that probably has something to do with it.
Okay. If we managed to get 2 cars squeezed into the 2 proposed parking spots and one of them caught fire, could it damage or even spread to the other car?
Oh yeah, you'd burn up both cars and the garage.
And you're saying, and the garage answered my next question. So it can spread from the car to the structure.
Oh, it absolutely can.
Okay, so we've got a safety issue there too. Okay, great. I appreciate your input on that. Does anybody have any questions for the chief? Okay, no other questions. Thank you, Chief. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Okay, board, is there anything else that we need to address before we reconvene back into regular session for discussion? All right. Is there a motion to reconvene to regular session?
So moved.
Ms. Reminier so moves. Is there a second?
Second.
Roger Ames seconds. Any objection to reconvening? Without objection, we're back in regular session. We can have a discussion here between the board members. Anybody want to offer something on this? Okay. Let me offer just a couple of quick comments here. Yes, Scott, you do have a practical difficulty. I don't think there's any question about that. But one of the biggest concerns that I've got here is exactly what Chief Deatherich brought up. And that's a safety issue of both the other vehicle and of the structure. I'd like to have the board take that into consideration as we consider this case. It's got a potential for making a poor situation even worse. So that's my input to the board. Anybody else have any comments?
Mike, that kind of brought my question to Chief Deatherage on the safety of the vehicle blocking the rear entrance to the house and being that close to the house, access for EMTs, firemen, and everything else, I think there's a safety concern, not just a fire in the vehicles, but a fire in the building itself or a medical emergency in the building. That would limit the egress.
Thank you. I agree with you.
I have
Any
one.
other? I'm sorry, Dan, was that you?
Chris.
Go ahead.
So just a point of order here. If Scott decided that he didn't want to go with this variance, but wanted to go a different way, would he have the opportunity to withdraw at this point?
I think you would have the opportunity to withdraw. I think what we'd do at this point in time is table this, and it'd have to be at Scott's request.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Little out of bounds here. Scott, since you've been mentioned in this, would you be willing to consider tabling the zoning request?
So the question I would have would be, I mean, clearly it looks like this parking is a problem. If I were to apply for a different variance, saying just to eliminate this parking entirely, so we wouldn't have all of these encroachments and everything else, that would be a different application. That's not a switch we could make through tabling tonight and coming back next month, right?
Agreed. Agreed. So Scott, having said that, do you want to proceed forward with this?
Sure.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Chris. Any other board members have comments? Chris Kennard?
Yes, sir.
Question for you. Can we incorporate the Duncan standards into the motion, or would you like to have us review them and go from there? Review meaning compare and contrast staff versus applicants.
I think given the nature of the discussion that we've had, I think it would be a good idea to use that as a means by which to summarize what we've heard for purpose of the record.
Okay. So my discussion here is going to be to the board members, and just as I've done in the past, where there's a motion and a second, and without objection, we enter into adjudication. I'm going to handle this comparison in the same manner. I will offer what's been stated by staff and applicant, and then ask if there's any objections. On Duncan Standard A, whether the property will or will not yield a reasonable return or can or cannot be used beneficially without the variance, staff has said it will, it could, as had the applicant. So I'm saying that it can issue or it can yield a reasonable return. Is there any objection to that summary? No objection. And usually in a situation like this, that would mean it was not support the granting of the variance. Any objection to that summary?
No.
No.
Okay.
Wait, can you say that again? That mean if we have no objections, it means what?
Well, what I'm saying here is that both the applicant and the staff has said it can offer a reasonable return for the property, usually because there is an alternative use where there's a beneficial use, a reasonable yield that would not support the granting of the variance.
Right.
Okay. Okay. Criterion B, the variance is or is not substantial. Staff has said it is and pointed out numerically that it is. Applicant says it is not because it's no change to the existing situation. Anybody object to that summary?
I agree that it is substantial. I agree with the staff.
I do too. I
Great.
agree.
Okay. Because it is substantial, that generally does not support the granting of the variance. On criterion C, the essential character of the neighborhood would or would not be substantially altered by the variance, and adjoining properties would or would not suffer a detriment as a result of the variance. Staff, excuse me, staff said it would, because you could have cars blocking the alleyway and impeding the use by other residents. The applicant says it is not, because there's no change to the occupancy or parking. Anybody object to that summary?
No, I agree with staff.
Might I add, Mike, Chief Deathridge's comments about the safety of the proposed parking spots regarding access to the house.
Rather than attach, excuse me, tickle. Rather than attach that to this particular criterion, I'd like to suggest that we discuss that as criterion H, other factors. So I agree with you, but let's do it a little bit later.
Accepted.
Okay, without objection from the board, because they're saying it, the agreement seems to be that staff is correct in this, that this does not support the granting of a variance. On criterion D, the variance would or would not adversely affect the delivery of governmental services. The staff said it would not, but we're talking about water, sewage, trash, that sort of thing, and the applicant agrees. Is there any objection to that summary?
No.
With the exception that there's no place for the garbage to be stored between pickups that's not in front of the building. I agree with that.
Great point, Chris. Thank you. Since there is no disagreement there, we're going to say that this does support the granting of the variance. Any objection to that?
Fine.
Okay. Criterion E, the property owner did or did not purchase the property with knowledge of the zoning restrictions. Staff said he did because of his past experience with building permits with the city. The applicant said he was not aware of it because he did not know that the unused garage was being considered a parking spot. On that particular portion by the applicant, I'm going to say that I believe he's incorrect, that the garage was even being considered a parking spot. So is there any objection to my summary on this point?
Can you repeat your summary?
The staff said that the owner should have known of the restrictions and the zoning code. The applicant said he was not, because he did not know that the unused garage was being considered a parking spot. But I think we've shown through testimony in this that that garage was not being counted as a parking spot.
I agree with that.
Okay. Any objections?
No.
Okay. Because of that, it's my interpretation that this does not support the variance being granted. Any objection to that summary?
No.
Thank you. Criterion F, the property owner's predicament can or cannot be feasibly obviated through some method other than a variance. Staff said it can, because the structure can be modified to provide code required parking, or the structure can be returned to its previous condition and use. Applicant says it cannot because the denial of the variance would prohibit the improvement of the property. Any objection to that summary?
No.
Thank you. Because it can be used as it was before, generally this was not going to support the granting of zoning variance. Any objection to that summary?
No.
No.
Thank you. Criterion G, the spirit and intent of the zoning code would or would not be observed and substantial justice done by granting the variance. Staff has said it does not, because had the proper process been followed, the same parking concerns would have been made aware to the owner. The applicant says it would, because it allows improvements to the properties and that do not negatively affect the health, safety, or welfare of the neighborhood. Excuse me, is there objection to that summary?
No.
No.
Thank you. Because of that, I'm going to interpret that as saying that this does not support the variance being granted. Any objection to that?
No.
No.
Excuse me. Finally, criterion H, other relevant factors. Roger, you brought in Chief Deathridge's comment. This would be the place to include those. Chief Deathridge has cited safety concerns and accessibility concerns, and I think those are relevant on that side of it. The applicant says that the property aligns with the comprehensive plan and improves the property. Is there an objection to my summary on this?
No.
Without objection. My interpretation is that this does not support the variance being granted. Is there objection to that conclusion?
No.
No.
Thank you. We have recommendations from staff saying that they opposed granting the variance. Engineering had a memo in here, which we did not discuss, that expressed concerns over the size of it. So between staff, fire, and engineering, I think we've got 3 recommending a denial of the zoning variance. Okay, having gone through that rather laborious process, is there a motion?
I
Yeah,
move we-
I'll move.
Ms. Rumineer moves. What is your motion, please?
What is my motion? It is. It is regarding, is it to, I don't know,
This-
maybe someone, I don't know how to do this language. Can someone
Would-
else move to the language properly?
Well, in light of that, would you prefer that one of the other board members make the motion? I
Yes.
realize that this is your first regular session.
Don't know how to do
Yeah.
the motion.
Okay. Roger, would you like to take care of that for us, please?
Yes. In the case of BZA 2020-02, requested variance to section 1149.03C, size of required parking lots, 1149.04A, location of required parking. I recommend that we deny the variances based on the criteria, Duncan criteria that we have just spent a great deal of time going through. That to me says that this is not a variance that we should make.
Okay, but Roger, being a bit more specific, could I suggest or offer that Duncan standards A, B, C,
Yes,
and
Duncan standards A, it will yield a reasonable return doing just exactly what it's been doing. Duncan standard criterion B, it is substantial in size and, in my humble opinion, substantial in the nearness to the house. Regarding C, whether the essential character of the neighborhood will be substantially altered, I believe that it will be because of the section, because of setting it at parallel to that alley, restricting access to the alley and restricting egress to the house. Criterion D, adversely affect governmental delivery. No, not the garbage. Yes, the fire and safety, if that could, if that would happen. Criterion E, property owner is a substantial investor with a history he should have known. Criterion E, whether the property predicament could be alleviated. Yes, it can by returning it to the original use. G, whether the spirit and the intent were behind the zoning requirements. That I don't believe that the granting of these variances would be within the spirit and intent. Criterion H, other relevant factors. Again, we talked about the safety factor being the biggest concern to me, egress to the house, egress to the alley.
thank you, Roger. Is there a second?
I second. Second.
Dan Hazeman seconds. Sam Perry, are you going to do the roll call? And a yes vote denies the variance.
Correct. Thank you. I'll start with Ms. Rumineer
Yes.
and Mr. Allison,
Yes.
Mr. Ames,
Yes.
Mr. Hazeman,
Yes.
Mr. Snipper.
Yes. The variance is denied. We have one more case to hear tonight. Excuse me while I cough once more. Sorry. The next case is going to be BZA case 2020-03. Mr. Conrad this is the same property, the same owner, and I'm going to make the same disclosure that I had before, where he is a customer of mine, but it's a very minor business relationship, and it's not going to affect my ability to reach an unbiased decision in this. Does anybody object to me participating in this?
No.
Without objection. We need a motion to enter into adjudication.
So moved.
Roger Ames moves. Is there a second?
Second,
No, it's Dan Haseman seconds. Any objection to entering into adjudication?
No.
Without objection, we are in adjudication. Zach, one more time, are you going to present for the city?
Yes, I will.
Please state your name and title for the record,
Zachary Moore, planner for the city of Oxford.
and raise your right hand, please. Do you solemnly swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth in matters before this board?
I do.
Please proceed.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Sam, if you would. Okay, so the final case of the night is another variance. This is at 230 East Withrow Street. This is 2 properties down from the previous one at 220. Next slide. Same applicant, same owner. Current use is also single family dwelling, and it's in the same zoning district, the R2MS single and 2-family mile square residential district. And the proposed variance is to section 1143.05C, front yard setback. Next slide, please. And here's the aerial map showing that it is on the northwestern corner of University Avenue and East Withrow Street. Next slide. And here once again is showing the zoning classification of R2MS, and everywhere within the vicinity is also zoned the same zoning classification, being that it's a residential neighborhood. Slide. Okay, so to get you acquainted with this case, very similar situation to the previous case at 220. These photos were taken on the exact same day on April 29th, showing the condition of the home that is there on the site. So what had happened was March 26th, a stop work order was issued because it was discovered that the existing open air porch, which is there on the eastern side of the structure, that there was some work going on as far as converting that and enclosing it. So that order was issued. The building permit to acknowledge the work that had already begun was submitted to us by Mr. Scott Webb on April 14th, and the permit was denied by the zoning division of the city on April 16th. So you can see there that they have, I don't know the extent of what work was done prior to the stop work order being issued. I believe there was railing present here on the porch that had been taken down. So as a result of that railing being taken down, you can see that there's some temporary boards that have been installed there on the porch just to make sure nobody falls off there. So just really as a safety precaution. Next slide. So the relevant zoning provision is in 1137.06B. This chapter 1137 addresses nonconformities. So it specifies that no nonconforming building or structure may be enlarged or altered in a way which increases its nonconformity, but any structure or portion thereof may be altered to decrease its nonconformity. Next slide. So the relevant portion of this provision is really the first part where it talks about a nonconforming building or structure being altered. So in this case, we would make the argument that it is being altered, and it is being done so in a way which increases its nonconformity in creating additional living area out of this presently open air porch setup. Next slide. So the relevant standard that makes it nonconforming is the front yard setback, which is 20 feet, and that is found in section 1143.05C. So that is the requested section to vary from. Next slide. And if the variance was granted, this would be the distance that you would be granting, which is basically the existing distance between the foundation and the front lot line along University Avenue, which measures 11 feet 4 inches. Next slide. And some bird's eye view shots for you to show the property location there, highlighted in yellow. There is a detached garage right there to the north. So you can see that as a separate little square there. And the porch is on the right-hand side. So Sam, if you would move your cursor over, that is the portion that we are talking about as the subject of this case. Next slide. And then this is looking toward the west, so you can see, in fact, that it is a detached garage there to the north, and then that gives you a better view of the porch that we are discussing. They're bordering along University Avenue. Next slide, please. So again, my familiar orange and blue. So the orange color is the portion of the porch that is conforming to the setback requirement of 20 feet. So this is the plan that Scott Webb provided us. So that dashed line that goes around the house and the garage, that is delineating, that is actually delineating the vacated right-of-way, which is 16 feet, 6 inches, or 16.5 feet. And that is something that our code actually allows variance from without needing the actual process to go to the BZA, so long as properties within the block are consistent with a reduced setback. So that is the reason why that orange portion is actually acceptable. However, the blue portion would not be acceptable through any administrative means through the code. That is a portion that would definitely require approval by the Board of Zoning Appeals to grant a variance for. So that looks to me like it's about maybe a little less than 2/3 of the porch that is being questioned here as far as its adherence or compliance with the setback. Next slide. And these are the elevations that were submitted with that after the fact building permit, showing that they intend to enclose this presently open air porch with new painted MDO board and new double hung windows on either side, on the east side and the south side. Next slide. And I would just point out also that they intend to keep the existing roof structure. And actually, Sam, if you don't mind going back to that slide, I apologize. The existing roof would remain. So you can see there what it notes existing vinyl siding. So that portion would remain as is. So they're just filling in the walls. So this is more or less kind of what we would call an infill project. It's all taking place within the footprint of the existing foundation. And you can see also the note there at the bottom that says it's the existing foundation. So that is not changing. There's no expansion to the foundation that is proposed as part of this request. Okay, and I'm ready for the next slide. Okay, so I will go through the decision criteria. Criterion A, whether the property in question will yield reasonable return or whether there can be any beneficial use. Property's previous and continued use as a single family dwelling is sufficient to demonstrate there can be beneficial use. Criterion B, whether the variance is substantial. So the applicant is asking for a 43.33% reduction in the front yard setback from the standard front yard setback of 20 feet, that is. But due to the pre-existing foundation and roof and the fact that the proposed project will not entail any new expansion or encroachment into the setback, we do not believe that this request is substantial. Regarding criterion C, whether the essential character of the neighborhood would be substantially altered or whether adjoining properties would suffer a substantial detriment, the outward appearance of this porch will not be substantially different from what already exists today. Therefore, staff believes that granting this variance would not result in any other detriment to the neighborhood. Criterion D, whether the variance would adversely affect the delivery of governmental services. We do not believe that these services will be adversely impacted by this request and this project. Most of the city departments did return the application. They did not have any comments, but had any comments concerning services been received, these might have contributed. Although the fire chief did comment he felt the conversion of the space was acceptable so long as it did not morph into a bedroom at a later point in time. Criterion E, whether the property owner purchased the property with knowledge. So Mr. Webb's letter mentions that the porch was previously screened in, but eventually converted to open air, set up with a railing. He mentions that the owner was not aware that erecting walls and windows would be in violation of a setback. The owner has previously submitted, as we've already said before, there's been a number of building permit applications that we've reviewed for the same owner in the past, and thus it should have been a familiar process, or at least warranted a phone call to us to ensure that the project could proceed with or without a permit. Criterion F, whether the property owner's predicament feasibly can be obviated through some method other than a variance. The only way to add more living space within the front setback area is through means of a variance. The property owner will not be deprived of economic use of the property simply because an existing porch cannot be converted into additional living space. Should the variance not be granted, the porch could be returned to its previous function, as the applicant does suggest in their letter. Regarding criterion G, whether the spirit and intent behind the zoning requirement would be observed and substantial justice done by granting the variance. Staff does believe granting the requested variance will uphold the spirit and intent behind the front setback requirement. The code does provide for an alternative average front yard setback adjustment, which I did explain already. And this is pursuant, I'll cite the section number for you, pursuant to section 1141.03 C3B. Though a distance less than 16.5 feet cannot be accommodated by right. However, the spirit of said section is to observe the characteristics of other properties in the vicinity in order to determine whether a lesser standard is acceptable in keeping with the neighborhood character. In this case, staff believes a lesser standard is acceptable for two reasons. Number one, the fact that the porch is a pre-existing feature. And number two, other properties in the vicinity, including 207 University Avenue, which is across the street to the east, also possess similar setback conflicts. So with that, that concludes my report. Staff does believe that there is substantial evidence in this case to support the variance request. Do you take any questions?
Thank you, Zach. Any questions from the board? No questions from the board. Thank you, Zach. Scott, you're going to present for the appellant.
Scott Webb, architect, agent for the applicant.
It's like you've done this before. Do
I'm
you
not a flat
solemnly,
learning curve.
do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth matters for this board?
I do, thank you.
Please proceed.
All right, we can just jump straight into the slides here. So. Okay, so I think once again, staff's done a very thorough job in their review. Clearly, my client got busy when the students moved out early this year. He felt like he could get a jump on doing some remodeling and some repair, and got a little carried away on Withrow Street. This is the second one we're on to this evening. The point of this was, as you can see from the picture up in the top right there, this has morphed through a lot of things over the years because of its height above grade. Railings are required, railings or half walls or something. You have to have guard protection. So the picture on the right sort of represents a code compliant structure in a state that it has been in the past. That I believe was probably done poorly and might have rotted away. We found another version in pictures that had a pressure treated rail, kind of a, inexpensive deck rail sort of knocked around the thing at the bottom in place of this. My client's intention is to bring it back more to this. If we could go on to the next slide. So the idea here is, simply to I mean, he could put screens in these openings, likely without needing a building permit. The question is, could he put windows in there instead of screens? And that is the intent of this. This is not a finished room. We're not insulating it. We're leaving the concrete slab that's there as it is. The building, or this portion, is not going to be heated or cooled in any way. We're just doing what a lot of people do to their houses, just sort of, while we're at it, turning it into kind of a 3-season room instead of a 1-season room. So it's just can be used sort of as it was, but just extend the season a little bit longer. So as staff pointed out, I think that this variance can be supported by the decision standards. This is an existing structure. What we're doing is not substantial, and it does not affect the essential character of the neighborhood. And the final slide is my version of the decision standards. So yes, we believe the existing one-family structure could remain. The variance is not substantial. It doesn't change the footprint of the building. It honestly doesn't change the conditioned area of the building with no heat or cooling provided in it. The essential character of the neighborhood would not be affected. We are intentionally buying windows to fit the existing porch openings rather than modifying the porch to fit some pre-purchased window, which would significantly change it, make it perhaps look more like a room and less like the porch that it was intended to be. So that is sort of by design, the approach there. As I said, my client got a little carried away with his remodel here, and figured he could put windows in instead of screens, and found a bunch of rot around the bottom and started fixing things, and went too far. And so in doing so, he was made aware that this is in fact in the front yard setback. I think actually, Sam, if you could go back one slide. One thing that was maybe not mentioned in either is that this being a corner lot, it actually requires 2 front yard setbacks and 2 side yard setbacks, no rear yard at all. So my client, with a house facing and an address on Withrow Street, assumed perhaps that was his front yard, and didn't consider that he had 2 front yards, or that adding windows to this existing porch would be in violation of the setback. Not to say he should have known that he needed a building permit, but he did not know that it was a zoning violation. So anyway, if we go back to the final slide then. So whether the owner's predicament can be feasibly obviated by some other means, certainly he doesn't have to put windows in there. He could put the screens in there. You could leave it entirely open either way. This is just simply a opportunity he felt to improve the property and get a little more use out of that existing porch. And then finally, the zoning code allows for improvements in general inside the walls, and we are encouraging infill and encouraging people to live, rental units in particular, in this portion of the mile square. So I think we meet some decision standards. I agree with staff and would appreciate your consideration.
Thank you, Scott. Any board members have a question for Scott?
I have one.
Ms. Rumanier?
So my understanding of both those presentations is that this is essentially a pre-existing structure, and there will be no changes to the footprint or the ground or concrete or utilities or heating or cooling or anything. And that therefore counts as improvement within the existing building. So it's like just fixing up the side of the living room in a way. Is that right? In terms of zone, I guess I question maybe here for staff, is that what the zoning code allows for? That it's okay to improve within the existing building structure?
Zach, do you want to take that, please?
Yeah, I could take that one. So what the code says is that you cannot alter a structure in a way that makes it more non-conforming. So we looked at this submission of a building permit in light of that standard, and our interpretation of that was that this was altering in a way that increased the nonconformity. by enclosing and infilling this existing porch, the porch of which did not meet the current setback standard. Does that make sense?
Yeah, except that the porch, okay, so it was already non-conforming. What is making it more non-conforming? Is it the enclosure?
Correct. It's the infill of the porch, increasing the living area, even though it may be living area that isn't heated or cooled through HVAC. We still consider it to be an improvement of the structure that is increasing the nonconformity.
Okay.
Okay. Anybody else? Nobody else has anything? Anybody else like to offer testimony in this case? No other testimony. I need a motion to reconvene to our regular session. Roger. And Roger moves, Dan Hazeman seconds. Any objection to reconvening?
No.
Without objection, we're back in regular session. Discussion or motion?
Discussion question. We're not supposed to make something more non-conforming, and yet staff have said this was okay because it's not making it increase to non-conforming, I think. I'm confused by staff recommendations on this.
Real honestly, I'm actually a little bit confused with it also. I think that they've found a loophole, so to speak, to allow this to happen, but I certainly understand your concern. The comparison to other properties in the same area does lend some credence to allowing this to go forward, however. So I understand your concern, but I think on this one, I'd probably side with staff. Chris Allison, are you on?
I am.
Do you have any comment on this being an increased nonconformity?
Well, it seems to me that he's taking a porch and making it doing an improvement to a porch. He's not really adding on to the building, but that's my view of what's here. I would object to it's not changing the character of the neighborhood, because if you look north and south on University, you find that this is the only building that sticks out. At least that was my view of it. But I don't think, and at first I was thinking, well, they're putting up walls and it's going to look, it's going to look like a big bulky thing sticking out there. Mm-hmm. But the way that I see the image with windows, it just looks like, hey, I took my screen porch and put windows in. So that's where I'm coming down on this.
Okay. In terms of this sticking out from in front of the building, this has been like this for a long, long time. I agree with you. It's simply improving a screened-in porch. But I think you may be a little bit inaccurate on that comparison to the rest of the neighborhood. It may have been that previous owner decided to put this on, may have been that it was on before the code went into effect and therefore grandfathered, and other properties chose not to do that. So it is unique, but I don't think I'd perceive it as that much of a negative.
Okay.
Anybody else? Chris Kennard? I think Chris Kennard went to sleep.
I shook my head because I have nothing to add. Thank you.
My question for Chris Kennard is it acceptable for us to include the Duncan standards in the motion, or would you like them reviewed?
No, I think we can include it in the motion.
Thank you. Is there a motion on this? Roger?
Busy night. Okay, in case BZA 2020-03, application for a variance to section 1143.05C front yard setback. I move that we grant the variance based on the criterion that it is not a substantial change. It's not going to change or affect the essential neighborhood, the essential character of the neighborhood. Won't adversely affect government delivery. And the spirit and intent of the zoning code will be enforced.
Thank you, Roger. Is there a second?
I second.
Dan Hazeman seconds. Roll call vote, Mr. Perry. And a yes vote grants the variance.
I'll start with Mr. Allison,
Yes,
Ms. Ruminaire,
Yes,
Mr. Ames,
Yes.
Mr. Haseman,
Yes,
Mr. Snipper.
Yes. Vote is 5-0. The variance is granted. That concludes our cases for tonight. Sam, do we have any cases for our June meeting?
We do not.
Okay, therefore the June meeting is going to be canceled. In closing, we have an ability here to do our meetings virtually, and unless the board objects, I would like to offer that our future meetings be virtually until such time as the majority of the board wants to go back to an in-person meeting, or the authority granted under House Bill 197 expires. Mr. Connor.
Yeah, I just want to explain that. Under House Bill 197, the legislature allows virtual meetings to take place until December. However, that's within now the way things are evolving, that is within the discretion of the body. And I say that in the sense of it's purely your discretion. We've come up with ways for meaningful participation. I think that Scott, on behalf of the applicant, would say it's better than putting people at risk, and the process seems to work. A little clunky on occasion, and certainly I think we'd all prefer to meet in person, but it works. So that's my long-winded way of saying the decision to meet virtually or in person is purely up to the discretion of this board as a body.
Sorry. Having heard all of that, does any board member object to that suggestion?
No.
Without objection. Okay, Sam, as we get applications in the future, would you please convey to the applicants that it will be a virtual meeting?
Yes, I will.
Thank you, sir. This has probably been one of our longest BZA meetings ever. It's been a little bit clunky because it's been virtual, but I certainly appreciate everybody's participation and patience. I need a motion to adjourn.
I so move.
They rushed to that one. Roger moves. Who seconds?
I'll second.
Ms. Ruminaire seconds. Without objection, we are in adjournment. Thank you.
thank you, everyone.
Good night, everyone.
Good night.
Bye, everybody.